what are some keys that vitamin D may be able to do to impact athletic performance?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research out there on this right now, and I can totally understand when people come to me and say they're pretty confused about what the literature says around vitamin D and athletic performance. For me, there are a few key areas the vitamin D can certainly have an effect on that can affect athletic performance both directly and indirectly. So I guess indirectly is likely to be through suboptimal immune function. As we know, vitamin D is a potent regulator of both the innate and acquired immune system. So work from Professor Mike Gleason's lab in Loughborough and also from some other groups, they've shown that athletes and military personnel with vitamin D deficiency have an increased incidence of upper respiratory tract infections and a longer number of days with those symptoms. Which, if you think about that from an athletic performance point of view, that means athletes are losing days of training and potentially days of competition. I think what's interesting about this area is that the amount of circulating 25 OHD seems to be higher than what is considered to be sufficient by the current guidelines in order to optimize immune function. So it appears that the break point for a reduction in infection risk is actually about 90 nanomoles per liter. So if we think back to what the current guidelines are of above 50 nanomoles per liter, we're quite a way off there. So that's really an interesting area, and certainly Mike Gleason is the guy to go and read up on if you're interested in that area. The second key area that really is of particular interest to me and where my research interests lie is in skeletal muscle. So we personally have performed quite a few trials on vitamin D and skeletal muscle, and the one where we've seen the most interesting effects was on a randomized controlled trial in which we took healthy individuals that had low 25 OHD, less than 50 nanomole per liter, and we supplemented them with either vitamin D3 or a placebo for 6 weeks. Now, prior to and following that intervention, we experimentally induced muscle damage by a high volume of eccentric muscle contractions, and then we monitored the recovery of force amongst some other markers of muscle damage. Mm-hmm. And we found a significant improvement in force recovery in the group that were supplemented with vitamin D versus the placebo. So, in keeping with this theme of translational physiology, we wanted to try and identify what was actually going on within the muscle that could potentially explain that benefit. So we took some muscle biopsies from vitamin D deficient individuals. We're able to isolate out muscle precursor cells, and we're able to use them in vitro in Petri dishes in the lab to do some extra experiments on them, and really it allows us to look at this in a little bit more detail. So we treated some cells with vitamin D and others without. We kind of mimicked a muscle damage in the dish, and then we looked at how the muscle was able to regenerate itself. So some of the key findings showed us that the cells weren't able to move as quickly to the site of damage, to fuse together, and to essentially regenerate that area that was damaged with the cells that only had that didn't have vitamin D. So basically, vitamin D was able to improve some cellular mechanisms that are responsible for muscle regeneration, which for us is a really cool finding, and it's something that we're trying to follow up and understand a lot more about at the moment. The final area for me, I guess, where vitamin D could certainly have an effect is obviously with its effects on bone. So bone is obviously the classical tissue through which vitamin D seems to have an effect, because vitamin D is a potent regulator of calcium absorption and bone mineralization. So, if we think back to that early work from Elmer McCollum, that's where we started to understand vitamin D and bone health. Now, bone is obviously a metabolically active tissue. It can remodel itself in response to different stimuli. And research has demonstrated that, vitamin D may be implicated in some aspects of this remodeling process. Unfortunately, observational studies they don't really affirm a proportionate susceptibility to bone loss if you've got low vitamin D concentrations. And we think the reason for that is because at least load-bearing exercise is a positive osteogenic stimulus for bone. So what that really means is that if athletes are load-bearing, they're likely going to have an improvement in their bone health, regardless of whether the vitamin D is high or low. To a certain extent, if it's really low, we still see some bone abnormalities. However, one sort of caveat to that is that obviously there are a lot of athletes that aren't weight bearing. So, for example, jockeys, or I guess, the likes of swimmers, guys who are spending a lot of time off their feet and not really doing load bearing exercise. Mm-hmm. We do still see that they have low bone mineral density when their vitamin D is low. So, for example, in jockeys, who are falling off the horse, all the time, we really focus on these guys trying to improve their vitamin D, because it could certainly lead to an increase in fracture risk and bone breaks. So really, to summarize that, the three key areas for me is probably immune function, skeletal muscle repair and remodeling, and potentially bone health are the ones that have got the most evidence at the moment for me.
Yeah, definitely some pretty significant consequences if you're a jockey, as you mentioned, and you get kicked off the horse. I mean, if your status isn't so good, then that's definitely a pretty significant consequence. And Dan, how much do vitamin D levels vary between groups of non-supplemented athletes?
Yeah, generally speaking, if athletes aren't taking supplements or using sunbeds, they have the same risk as everyone else and between each other, because it has very little to do with the diet, but a lot to do with the environment. With that being said, some of the work that came from our lab in sort of 2013, showed quite a large variation actually between cohorts of elite athletes. So we looked at elite rugby players, soccer players, and also jockeys, and we saw pretty big variation between these guys. And our explanation for that really was that there could be a number of explanations. One, it could be dietary differences between the cohorts. It could be sunlight exposure differences, although it's probably not likely because most of the measurements were made in the winter and all of our guys were based in the UK, so very similar sunlight exposure. Could be due to clothing. Again, if you're fully clothed, or if you're only sort of 50%, that's going to have an impact on how much sunlight your skin sees, and also lifestyle as well, predominantly living indoors or training indoors. And I guess really for us, that kind of has important ramifications for supplementation, because it tells us that we can't really just assume that all athletes in the winter months have the same requirements for vitamin D. So we've tried to kind of help out with that by producing a decision flowchart in one of our recent reviews in the Journal of Sports Medicine. And, that kind of helps practitioners and, people working with professional athletes to try and make the right decision of whether they should or they shouldn't be supplemented with vitamin D. One area that we've been working on, and I guess I've not really talked about, or we've not really published any data on yet, is that, and we find super interested in, and an area that we're going to follow up, is that when we look back through our data and we look at some athletes that have higher muscle mass, we tend to see that those guys also have higher serum 25-OHD levels in the winter, despite the fact that all of these guys shouldn't, when we test them, be on any vitamin D or using sunbeds.
Yeah.
They tend to have this higher serum 25-OHD, and that's really brought around this idea that, well, perhaps actually muscle is a storage site for 25-OHD.
Interesting.
And there is actually some sort of more basic evidence that supports that. So there's a paper that's been published which demonstrates actually that the 25-OHD that's bound to its binding protein can be taken up by muscle and actually stored bound to actin for a short length of time. Now, that's not been shown in humans just yet, but it really is interesting to think, okay, if 25-OHD can be taken up by muscle, how long can it be stored there for? How is it released again back into the circulation? And what implication does that have for our supplementation strategies? If we're working with guys who, maybe in a rugby team where we have some players who are 125 plus kilograms and some who are maybe in the 80s, does that have an implication for how we approach supplementation? So, clearly it is quite a complex picture when it comes to variations in athlete vitamin D status. And, I really do think that anyone who's working with large groups of professional athletes, it's something that we really have to take into account. And hopefully our recent review can sort of maybe help assist with the decision-making process.